audit findings from the recent audit that the VBA conducted. My name is Amanda Wellesley. I'm the Special Projects Lead in the Office of the State Building Surveyor, and I'll be looking after you today. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who may be joining us today. It's been a little over a year since Victoria witnessed another devastating bushfire season, with many communities in the east of the state experiencing the effects of that severe fire season. The VBA very quickly mobilised, with much of the industry as well, to offer support and technical assistance to the local councils and communities to facilitate the safe return to their homes and assess the damage. We've continued to engage and offer that support, working with Bushfire Recovery Victoria, as well as travelling to affected areas regularly to provide information and resources to assist the rebuild effort. We know that the community is in different stages of recovery. As you may expect, many are not yet at the point of rebuilding their homes damaged or destroyed by the fires. But we are starting to see a return to construction activity in these areas. So it's timely that we check in with industry to help ensure that the rebuild efforts comply with relevant standards, and that the community can move forward with confidence in the protection that their homes may afford them in the future. So our session today covers the findings of the VBA's recent building audit on building permit approvals in bushfire-prone areas across the state, and we'll also offer some practical guidance and address some of the issues that we identified. We do encourage you to ask questions throughout the session today. I'd like to draw your attention to the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. We have dedicated some time at the end of the session to answer as many as possible, so please do keep those questions rolling in. I'd also just like to remind you that today's session is being recorded, and along with all of the other VBA educational resources will be available on the VBA website and our YouTube channel following today's session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to your presenter today, Keesje Wassink. Keesje has experienced firsthand the impacts of the 2015 and 16 Western Australian bushfires, and has developed a passion for bushfire safety and prevention. Keesje, he has completed a Bachelor of Construction Management and a Graduate Diploma in Building Surveying, and he's worked as a building surveyor in local governments in Western Australia, including those that were at the forefront of introducing the requirements in bushfire-prone areas before statewide provisions were introduced. Keesje is registered as a Level 1 building surveying practitioner in Western Australia, and we were lucky to have him join the VBA in 2019, where he's been part of the building audit business unit since then, and is currently acting manager of building audit. So without further ado, take it away, Keesje.
Thank you, Amanda, and welcome all to the second webinar of the VBA education series, and thank you for attending today. Today's webinar, as Amanda mentioned, is on the findings of the VBA's bushfire audit and the way forward in terms of the VBA's expectations around building permit documentation. So the outcomes for today's webinar are understanding the compliance trends in design and approval of buildings in bushfire-prone areas, understanding the minimum level of documentation required to demonstrate compliance, and understanding the roles and responsibilities of key stakeholders in the process. So before I get into the audit findings, I'll just provide some background information on the auditing process. So the VBA has committed to a building surveyor audit program, which will see all registered building surveying practitioners performing functions under the Act audited at least once every 3 years. This comes from the ministerial expectation and aims to improve the confidence in the building industry, protect good performers, improve the quality of poor performers, and provide a basis for where legislative reform and education is required. Like the proactive inspections program, data and trends will be published, and this information will be used to educate industry and guide legislative changes. So the audit process. So our audits are scoped into items that are high risk to life safety of building occupants. So in Volume 1 of the National Construction Code, the focus is On Section B, structure, Section C, fire safety, Section D, access and egress, and Section E, services and equipment. Whilst in Volume 2, the focus is on structural, fire safety and occupant safety, such as swimming pools, stair construction, and barriers to prevent falls. So the audits are desktop assessments based on the Section 30 documents we obtain from Council. We don't attend sites as part of this audit program. However, the information from our audits is utilised by the proactive inspections team, and they use that for areas to focus on when they're on site. So when we undertake the audits, we consider 4 elements. The first being whether the particular clause would be applicable to this particular building. Then we consider whether there's sufficient information for the RBS to make a determination, the responsible building surveyor to make that call about whether compliance is achieved or not. The third is whether the information is compliant and non-compliant. And then the fourth thing, which is kind of interlinked with the third, is the compliance solution used, whether it was DTS, deemed satisfied, or a performance solution, or a combination of these. So as part of this RBS audit program, which we only started towards the end of last year, we undertook 35 site inspections on bushfire prone areas against the requirements of Australian Standard 3959/2018 being the relevant standard at the time for construction of buildings in bushfire prone areas. This was, as Amanda mentioned before, in response to those bushfires that occurred in the summer of 2019-2020, in which there were reported 313 homes that were damaged and destroyed. So, as I mentioned, we do a desktop assessment of the Section 30 documents, and this was undertaken against the provisions of Section 3 to 10 of the Australian Standard for Bushfire Prone Areas, so the specific BAL requirements. We did not consider whether the bushfire attack level BAL rating had been correctly determined under Section 2. We just relied on this being accurate. So some of the background on the sites audited. So the audits were undertaken on sites in 8 different municipalities. These were mainly those impacted by bushfires in recent years. So we can kind of see on the screen now, we've got South Gippsland, East Gippsland, Alpine and Latrobe, as well as Towong. And in past years, we've had some fires around Corangamite in the Wye River and the like. So the sites were selected for different BAL ratings to gauge whether there was different levels of compliance depending on the complexity of the BAL rating. So 34 of the audits were on new buildings and 1 was on an extension, and 29 of the building permits were issued to registered builders, and the remaining 6 were issued to owner builders. Predominantly, the audits were on single story. However, we did do one 3-story and maybe 6 2-story buildings. And the audit sample was from 27 unique RBSs. Of the 35 audits completed, there was an average of 15 non-compliances per audit. Generally, the non-compliances were consistent across the locality, the BAL rating, the practitioner type, and the number of stories. With some of the smaller sample sizes in some of the localities and BALs and stories, this will account for that discrepancy where we can see some only had 5, while others had more. So what did we find? So this information is presented in groups of the sub-clauses under each of the main elements, and we combined all the different BAL levels related to that into one kind of sub-element. So on the screen, we have the results from Section 3, which is the general construction requirements of AS 3959. So it was found in the audits that the plans generally lacked the information required by the relevant building surveyor to make a determination of compliance against the standard. As we can see in most of the cases, there was insufficient information for the RBS to make a determination against the clause. For example, with sarking, the product to be used was not specified, so there was no information to assess whether the sarking complied with the required flammability index, and the same goes for how the weep holes, vents and other gaps would be protected. There was no information, so there was no way of seeing whether the product would comply. Some instances we did see, it was great to see that the mesh was being used in those ones, but not all of the plans had that information. As I mentioned before, we looked at sufficiency of information. And so the key areas of information for specific construction requirements in section 3 to 9, which are the specific BAL levels 12.5 through to Flamezone. There was glazing didn't have any details of the thickness, so there was no way of determining if it had the minimum thickness required for that BAL rating level. For external walls, the material being used was not specified, only vague terms such as weatherboards. Therefore, it's unable to determine if it would be non-combustible or a bushfire resisting species as required by the standard. For verandas and decks, the type of timber that was being used so that it could be confirmed that the timber was a bushfire resisting species. And this was found by our proactive team that have been out on sites, that the timber used in the veranda post hasn't actually been a bushfire resisting species. For the compliance outcomes, if there was not sufficient information, as I mentioned, for us to determine that something complied, we had to mark this as non-compliant. Going forward, our audits will be looking to separate these non-compliances where there is insufficient information to determine if it complied, and those where the plans showed a material non-compliance, so we can gain a better understanding if it's just something is non-compliant because there wasn't information to determine it, or whether the building surveyor had approved something on the plans that was actually incorrect. So some of the non-compliances against section 3, which we did find, were with weep holes and gaps. So the incorrect notation to the clause was used, such as only screen gaps greater than 3 mil rather than 2 mil. And this could be related to, there was a change in the standard between 2016 and 2009 and the 2018 version, which changed that kind of requirement, and maybe the notations on the plans weren't updated to reflect the new requirements. For specific construction requirements for sections 5 to 9, some of the non-compliances that we found were the incorrect thickness of glazing. So where 5 mil was required, 3 or 4 mil had been specified. Where screening was required to a window, it had not been nominated, or the incorrect material type had been nominated. For roofs, that had not been adequately sealed to prevent embers entering the roof space, and there was unsealed roof penetrations such as whirlybirds. And during the proactive inspections, it was identified on site where pipework penetrating the roof was PVC, where it was required to be non-combustible. Another item which we kind of identified was subfloor not enclosed, or when unenclosed, the subfloor support material was not specified as a non-combustible material or a bushfire resisting species. So now I've provided some background on the audit. I'll go through and highlight some of the legislative requirements and roles and responsibilities in the process and documentation required to demonstrate compliance. So legislative requirements. So section 24(1) says that a building surveyor must not issue a building permit unless they are satisfied that the building work and the building permit will comply with the Act and the building regulations. Therefore, if the plans and specifications do not have the information required to demonstrate compliance, then the RBS should be asking the applicant for more information or refusing the permit if that information is not forthcoming. And some other regulations to consider in the building permit in bushfire-prone areas. So Regulation 156 requires the RBS to accept a bushfire attack level specified in a planning scheme or any site assessment for planning permit, despite anything contrary to in the BCA. The other one, which is really important, is Regulation 157, which requires the responsible building surveyor to accept a bushfire attack level is at least 12.5. So if a property is in a designated bushfire prone area, regardless as to whether it has been deemed low. And we saw this in the audits, that this is what building surveyors had been doing, where there was a site assessment that came back as low, and they had required the provisions of BAL 12.5 to be applied to that building as required by that regulation. So that's really good. The areas for bushfire prone area declared by the Minister for Planning under Section 192A of the Act, and a property report can be generated from the Vic Plan website to see whether a property is in a bushfire prone area. Most of Victoria outside of metropolitan and township areas is considered bushfire on this mapping. So it's important to kind of think about that. Often we kind of think about areas out in the far away, like East Gippsland and that, as being bushfire prone areas, but there's a lot of interface around our urban growth corridors for bushfire prone areas, and where these requirements are also required to be applied. Regulation 158, this in effect extends the BCA Volume 1 bushfire requirements to apply to Class 9A and 9C buildings in certain schools, early childhood centres, and any Class 4 part, and any Class 10A building or deck associated with these buildings. So whilst Volume 1 only kind of talks about Class 2 and Class 3 in the NCC, and obviously Volume 2 talks about Class 1 and Class 10A, the regulations in Victoria have extended those provisions to apply to those specific Class 9A and 9C buildings. So if you're doing a 9A, 9C building or the like that might be impacted, it's important to check whether it's in a bushfire prone area as well, and then apply these provisions. The bushfire standard is called up as a deemed to satisfy option in the building code under NCC Part G5 in Volume 1, and under Part 3.1.0.5 in Volume 2. So the current version referenced is AS 3959/2018, and that's a new version of the 2009. It was amended. And also just an extra consideration now is that from the 1st of January, the Code of Conduct for Building Surveyors came in. So it's important for all kind of practitioners to remember that the building surveyors are bound by that, and they're obviously trying to uphold that Code of Conduct when you're dealing with them. So if they're asking for more information, this is because they're trying to make sure that they're following what they're required to do. So roles and responsibilities in the process. So everyone has their part to play in ensuring that buildings are constructed in bushfire prone areas that they're safe. So planning departments and planning schemes can set specific requirements for certain areas. And the first step should be to determine if there are any specific planning requirements for your property, any overlays of bushfire management plans and the like. Bushfire consultants can be engaged to complete a site assessment and determine the bushfire attack level rating. When they're doing this, they should ensure that they're determining the BAL using the right fire danger index level in Victoria. So this is either 50 in alpine areas or 100 generally. Obviously in other states, there's a different fire index rating. They should also be attending the site to accurately measure and classify the vegetation. For designers should be ensuring that they are preparing the plans and specifications, that all the required information to show compliance with the standard is detailed on the plan and in the specifications. This helps everyone kind of when they're building the building, when it's being approved. If the information's there, it makes it a lot easier and we can avoid any kind of problems down the track during construction that may require rectification. The applicant is obviously responsible for ensuring that they provide sufficient information to the building surveyor for them to make a determination of compliance. And if you don't have all the information required, you shouldn't be applying for a permit until you're ready to go. And the building surveyor has everything that they'll need to make that decision. The building surveyor obviously has a key role in determining that the plans and specifications comply with the Act. If there is insufficient information, the RBS should require additional information, or if they can't get this, as I mentioned before, refuse that permit. They should also be ensuring that the building is constructed in accordance with the plans when they're undertaking the inspections, and the as constructed is just as important as the plans being right. For the builders, they should ensure that they follow the approved plans and not deviate from them, as changing products or construction methods may impact the as constructed compliance. Where the builder is unclear about a product or construction method, they should confirm this with the RBS to ensure that a compliant material or method is used. If, for example, a particular EPS product has been specified and the product is changed on site, this could result in a product that hasn't been tested being installed. So before discussing what documentation is required, it is important to understand that each bushfire attack level is trying to achieve different outcomes. The number in the BAL rating corresponds with the increments of radiant heat expressed in kilowatts per meter squared. Humans can feel pain after 10 to 20 seconds of being exposed to radiant heat of 4 kilowatts per meter, while some materials such as dry timber can ignite at 12 kilowatts, and a bushfire can reach 100 kilowatts. So even at BAL 12.5, humans would be starting to be quite maybe overcome by the heat. So there are three main ways a bushfire can impact a structure. This is ember attack, radiant heat, and direct flame contact. So each of the BAL ratings is designed to respond to the level of impact these three factors can have. Ember attack is the most common way a house can catch on fire, and embers can often impact a structure kilometres ahead of the fire front, whilst radiant heat can ignite surfaces without direct contact. So this is why we see usually with the assessments that usually they talk about at least 100 metres, but obviously a house can be impacted a lot further ahead than 100 metres. So BAL 12.5 is primarily concerned with the protection from ember attack and radiant heat up to including 12.5 kilowatts per metre squared, where the site is less than 100 metres from the source of a bushfire attack. Most construction requirements in BAL 12 point are designed to prevent embers entering the structure and allowing for direct contact or ignition of the structure from those embers. In BAL 19, it's primarily concerned with the protection again from embers and radiant heat greater than 12.5 kilowatts and up to and including 19 kilowatts. For BAL 29, it's primarily concerned with protection again from ember attack and radiant heat greater than 19 kilowatts and up to and including 29 kilowatts. BAL 40 is primarily concerned with protection from ember attack, increased likelihood of flame contact, and the radiant heat greater than 29 kilowatts and up to and including 40 kilowatts. And then Flamezone is where there is flame contact and also ember attack and the radiant heat of more than 40 kilowatts. So this is why there are different BAL requirements and materials in each BAL level. Some are focused on preventing embers, while others are focused on actual radiant heat or then direct flame contact. So what to include and to avoid when designing or approving a building? So you should include the exact part of the clause that applies. Many clauses have multiple options to achieve compliance. Therefore, the plans and specifications should indicate which option is being used to achieve compliance. E.g., for protection of glazing, you would state that the window has corrosion-resistant mesh bronze screen with apertures less than 2 mils. You wouldn't, if you're not using bushfire shutters, you wouldn't mention about that. You're detailing the relevant information on the plan, so it should be clear and only the relevant information, as I just mentioned. If the building doesn't have bushfire shutters on it, then there shouldn't be a reference to it. This makes it easier for practitioners to see the required information and determine compliance and construct the building, including evidence that demonstrates compliance. How can the building surveyor be satisfied that a product complies if there is no details of what that product is? Evidence of suitability, such as code mark certificates or data sheets that detail the material to be used, test reports should be supplied with the application so that a responsible building surveyor can check these and make sure they comply. For example, with sarking, the building surveyor needs to check the flammability index. So they would need some evidence of this information so that they can check that it's right. What you should avoid is using generic terms such as Windows to AS39594.6.5. It's not useful for the person checking compliance and constructing the building, as they don't know if the window is protected by a shutter or a screen, or what type of screen, what the glazing thickness is, etc. Also avoid cutting and pasting. Adding swathes of information from the standard doesn't really help. The plan should have the relevant information to determine compliance and be clear. Cutting and pasting often results in the wrong or irrelevant information being put on the plan. And this was seen in our audits where generic notes, as I mentioned before, had the wrong information on them because they hadn't been updated and the clauses had changed. And probably the most important one is don't assume that the person that's reading the plans knows the standard. The person constructing on the site only has the building permit to work off. It's unlikely that they have the standard on site and will know what is in the standard. Designers and building surveyors are the experts and responsible for making sure the builder can build from the plans. It was identified on site through our proactive inspections that where there were owner builders or builders with less experience in bushfire prone areas, that there was more non-compliances in the as constructed than there was kind of found by those builders that, yes, had a lot of experience working in these areas, so knew the standard. So it's just important to remember that not everyone has all the same level of knowledge about the standard. So what is required when preparing the plans and approving the documentation? Site plans should show all the buildings and the setbacks, including setbacks from adjacent structures on the subject allotment. If the buildings are not building setbacks are not detailed, how can it be determined if the adjacent structure is required to comply with the standard as well? We observed instances in our audits where the structures that didn't have a setback, but on scaling the plan, the structure was within 6 meters and therefore required to comply with the standards. But the plans didn't show that this actually complied, this adjacent structure. There was also garages where there was no details that they were separated from the dwelling. And again, the plans didn't show that they complied with the standard. You should include section details. If you've got an attached structure and you're trying to separate it and not make that attached structure comply, you need to have kind of a section detail which shows how that's built so that the builder can build that and know that the attached structure won't impact on the dwelling. Should have evidence of suitability. So if you're using, say, for instance, lightweight construction to separate the two buildings, you should have the test report provided, and as again, the detail of how that kind of wall system separates the adjacent structure or attached structure to the dwelling that's required to comply. And the same for if there's a doorway going between them, attest that door complies with the required FRL, and the same with windows in that kind of separating FRL construction. There may be cases as well where you're utilising the provision to reduce the construction requirements due to shielding. So when doing this, the plan should clearly differentiate that this is used, and in each side, so that the builder can see that the different levels are required in each area. Compliance for floors can be achieved through a number of methods, most commonly being concrete slab on ground, and the standard doesn't provide a requirement for concreted floors. However, for other materials where a structure is raised, either the subfloor space needs to be enclosed or the floor is required to comply. The subfloor can be enclosed with a wall that conforms to the same requirements as an external wall or mesh sheet as per the standard. Where the subfloor is not enclosed, the plans need to show the materials used in the construction to comply with the standard. It was observed in the audits where a second story was overhanging a lower deck area, and the underside of the second floor to a habitable room hadn't been protected where it was required to be. So for external walls, there's a variety of materials that can be used depending on the BAL rating to achieve compliance. But generally the exposed component needs to be non-combustible to some degree, e.g. in the lower BALs, it's just the lower 400 above the finished ground level. In higher BALs, it might be the entire wall. It was observed during the audit that some of the plans did nominate the external wall material, and as I mentioned before, they used vague terms such as weatherboard. The specific product should be nominated, and any evidence of suitability that demonstrates compliance provided where a material outside of those listed in the standard is used. This way that the building surveyor can check that the product is non-combustible as required. So for glazing bushfire shutters, if you're using those, and you need to have evidence that the shutters will protect the entire window or door, including the frame, you should have a window or door schedule, and it should provide the glazing thickness and the type of glazing, e.g. toughened, and also any screening material where required. So we identified that in the audits that there were no sort of schedules on a lot of the plans. We used the energy efficiency report, and we saw that nominated the wrong glazing thickness. And then where there were window schedules, they weren't also consistent with the energy efficiency, and the wrong glazing was nominated. So 3 mil or 4 mil instead of where 5 mil was required. For window and door protection, if it's being screened, the screening material such as bronze, and then the aperture thickness should be nominated. Some of the plans that we saw only had fly screen nominated, so it was unclear whether this would just be a standard fly screen that you can have on any house, or it was going to be one that would meet the requirements and have the be bronze and have less than 2 mil apertures. And we also saw on some where the screening had the wrong aperture size nominated. For garage door protection, the plans need to nominate the material and how the gaps are sealed. In some audits, we found that there was no detailing of the requirements to seal those gaps, and those garages were not detailed as being separated from the building, so they were required to comply with the standard. For roof material, nominating on the plans and detailing materials, including verandas and carport and awning roofs. Roof gap sealing, nominating on the plans and detailing how gaps are sealed. And again, this could be nominating that you're using a non-combustible mineral wool in the ridge or using sarking. Again, as mentioned before, when you're using sarking, you need to have that kind of evidence of suitability so that the building surveyor can check the flammability index. But also it's important to kind of have details of how that sarking will be installed so that the builder can see where it needs to go, exactly how it needs to go over different parts of the roof structure to make sure that it's fully sealed or protected from embers entering the building. For roof penetrations, including ventilators, evaporative units, you need to nominate on the plan and the type and extent of penetrations and how they'll be protected and what materials to be used and the aperture size. For roof skylights, you should nominate the skylight product that's going to be used and providing kind of test reports that validate that that product complies. For eave protection, nominating on the plans the eave material, including how gaps will be sealed. For gutters, nominating the material to be used. Box gutters, nominating the material and the detail, the flashing and how this is sealed. And obviously if you're using leaf guards, nominating what material that is because it's required to be non-combustible. For verandas, the post material should be nominated. Some BALS allow for bushfire resisting timber, whilst others require non-combustible material. For decking construction, whilst there is no requirement to enclose the subfloor space of verandas, decks, steps, ramps, or landings, there are some requirements when this space is enclosed, and in some BAL levels, the decking shall not be spaced. So consideration of this needs to be made for each bushfire attack level, and it's important for this information to be detailed on the plan so that the builder knows that the construction method required is different. For trafficable surfaces, stairs and landings, the materials need to be nominated as each BAL rating has a different level of requirement. While some lower BALs allow for PVC type materials and bushfire resisting timbers, others require the material to be non-combustible. For water and gas supply pipes, most of the plans that we looked at didn't nominate this material. So it's important, I suppose, to nominate these on the plan and how it's going to comply to avoid kind of plumbers using the wrong material. Also, the standard doesn't really apply or provide a provision for it, but it's also important just to have a consideration about if you're going to be using gas bottles, where you're going to kind of have these. The last one that I just touch on is when constructing in Flamezone. So where a building has been assessed under Section 2 to determine the bushfire attack level, and it has a minimum setback of 10 metres from the classifiable vegetation, it can be constructed in accordance with clause 9.2 to 9.8 of the standard. But in other circumstances where a 10-metre setback cannot be achieved in Flamezone, the elements less than 10 metres need to conform to or have a test to AS 1530.8.2. So basically, you have to use a tested system if you're in a flame zone and the component is less than 10 metres from the classifiable vegetation. Just lastly, I kind of mentioned about evidence of suitability, and it's important to kind of have this to demonstrate that a product complies with the standard. When assessing this documentation, the building surveyor should consider whether the evidence demonstrates compliance by a deemed to satisfy solution or by performance. So some code marks are for compliance with performance requirements rather than deemed to satisfy provisions. So this can be the case for some EPS products, which are combustible when tested in accordance with AS 1530.1. However, they've been tested and it's being considered under the code mark scheme that maybe that this product would be suitable still in a bushfire prone area. However, where this is the case, a performance solution should be developed by and then the building surveyor should make a determination under Regulation 38 that the product complies with the performance requirement. And the code mark would obviously form part of that performance solution that's being developed. So from here, our proactive inspections team have, as I've mentioned throughout, have recently completed inspections on dwellings in bushfire prone areas in East Gippsland to see if there's been kind of a translation of the poor documentation into on-site non-compliances, and they'll be publishing a report with those findings. We'll be providing education to practitioners to improve their quality. This webinar is kind of, I suppose, the first part of that. We'll also be developing some other practice notes and information to help everyone out and help understand the requirements. Down the track, we'll do further auditing to gauge whether the quality of documentation has improved and where further improvements required. And as I mentioned, we'll be developing sort of further education material, which details the minimum documentation requirements that will be published by us later. So just a bit of a summary. Hopefully now you have an understanding of the audit process that we went through and kind of that we found what we found and that there was a lack of documentation and detailing on the plans for building surveyors to make a determination on compliance and be satisfied. The impacts kind of for building is that buildings may not be constructed properly, and our proactive inspections team found non-compliances on site that correlated with those that we found in the plans, and that information that was missing resulted in kind of non-compliances on site. Hopefully now everyone kind of has a bit of an idea of what information is required to be on plans so that building surveyors can make those determinations, and that we can ensure that the buildings are constructed correctly and hopefully avoid any issues arising on site which would require rectification. We want to save building surveyors and builders and consumers time with having to fix things on site when something comes up during construction that wasn't detailed correctly on the plans. So just some further resources on that can be found on sort of bushfire prone construction. The ABCB, Australian Building Codes Board, has a National Construction Code CPD course, which is on their website. The bushfire standard can be downloaded for free from the Standards Australia supplier text street. So yeah, you can get you don't need to pay for the latest version. It's been made free so that everyone has access to it, and we can make sure that these buildings are constructed and safe. And lastly, the CFA has also on their Learning Hub some courses for planning for construction in bushfire prone areas, and also kind of for those working in bushfire prone areas. And that's the end of the presentation and question.
Thanks so much, Keesje. Some really great content there and lots of really awesome questions coming through. So we might turn our minds to how we can answer some of those. And to help us do that, I just wanted to introduce you to Matt Waters, who is the Acting Senior Manager of Technical and Regulation at the VBA. Matt also holds a graduate diploma of building surveying, is a level 1 building surveying practitioner in Western Australia, and has much of that experience with bushfire prone areas and certification in that space, as Keesje does. He's also a lecturer at CQU in building surveying, design and construction management. So thank you for joining us, Matt.
And yeah, so Keesje and I are just going to answer some of the questions that people have. So I've kind of been looking at some during, so I'll give Keesje some time to read some. There was a bit of a general kind of theme that a few people had, which was about whether this is going to be sent to draftspersons or designers as well. So it's definitely not building surveyor centric. We're not trying to put all the blame on the RBS by any stretch. It's a kind of team effort. Everyone has some responsibility, and Keesje kind of talked about that in his presentation around each individual's responsibility to you know, document and then determine compliance. So yeah, the whole system about who's involved is definitely getting considered. I've got a question from Crystal Russell, who's asked, who is the building surveyor legally obliged to accept a BAL assessment from? So that's a pretty good one. So essentially, in the regulations, the building surveyor must accept a BAL determination if it's either specified in a local planning scheme, or if there's been a planning permit required and a site assessment for the bushfire attack level was considered as part of that application. In terms of any other scenario, so if it's just designated in a bushfire prone area and there's a bushfire attack level assessment provided, the building surveyor would need to satisfy themselves that the person who undertook that assessment is suitably qualified and experienced to determine that. Noel Gosling had a question about if the site is designated as not in a bushfire prone area, does this mean that the building must still comply with BAL 12.5 as you stated? So I think with that, it's the building must be in a designated bushfire prone area. So that's the scenarios where if the site's designated as BAL low, it needs to be treated as it was BAL 12.5 for the purpose of the assessment. There's some general ones about just the information. So Michael had a question about flammability requirements for sarking and the fact that it's replicated in the BCA for general domestic building work where sarking's used, or there's a few other things in there as well. The question's really about should product technical statements demonstrating the fire hazard properties be met. Is that what the VBA is suggesting? So yeah, so there needs to be some evidence of suitability in terms of being satisfied of compliance. In this specific circumstance that you're mentioning, that would be a 1530 Part 2 test report in that scenario. So there needs to be some demonstration of compliance. I might pass over to you, Keesje, if you have picked any out that.
Jumping with a broad question. There's been a couple there related to the assessment, the detailed assessment of BAL assessments themselves. So, to what extent did the audit look into, you know, I suppose the suitability and the accuracy of BAL assessments? Yeah, can you sort of expand on our approach there?
Yeah, sure. So with this, we didn't undertake that assessment of the bushfire attack level that was nominated. We accepted that the person that has done this did it accurately. This was mainly kind of, we're just trying to see that the plans matched what was being asked of. So if the BAL level was incorrectly nominated to start with by the consultant or whatever that did that, then obviously the whole plans are probably going to not be accurate as well. So we basically took it off. Were the plans reflective of what they said that they were going to be? So if the plan said it was going to be 12.5, are the plans approved to that? Obviously, there's other work that needs to be done about looking into how accurately those BAL assessments are being done, and if they're accurate and correct. But this was a case of the building surveyors being given a document, and now they're approving a plan based on that BAL level. Is that correct, and has it matched up?
Excellent, thanks, Keesje. And just as a bit of a follow-on from that, what are the minimum, I suppose, qualifications, skills, and/or experience that practitioners should be looking for in assessing or in appointing someone to carry out a BAL assessment and accepting that BAL assessment?
So they might be looking for something like, you know, registration with Fire Protection Association of Australia or something as a bushfire. If they have their accreditation or something, you really want someone to have kind of professional indemnity insurance. So just verifying those types of things in determining if someone is, you know, suitably qualified and experienced, asking for a CV to see if they've done similar work in the past. But yeah, as a professional accreditation scheme, like something that FBA have, would be a starting point.
Excellent, thanks, Matt. A couple of questions throughout the feed were related to the applicability of bushfire construction, where a designated bushfire prone area or bushfire management overlay only covers part of the allotment. Either Keesje or Matt, you able to just expand on how to approach that from a design and compliance perspective?
So take it that's so only part of the site's designated?
Yeah, so I took a couple of those questions to mean, I suppose, if you, depending on the placement of the of a building, for example, you know, if the bushfire management overlay only covers a portion of where that building is designed to be placed on the allotment, to what extent does the bushfire requirements apply?
Yeah, so in terms of the performance requirements, and I think this wording is replicated in the deemed to satisfy provisions as well, but it refers to the building being located in a designated bushfire prone area. So if the building isn't in the area, then there would be no compliance requirements, would be my suggestion.
And maybe just on that, Matt, I think also maybe some of the questions were kind of if half of the building is in the area and half of the buildings out of the area, what's the level of requirement compliance required to that building? And I would say that the whole building still needs to comply if part of the building needs to comply.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Thank you. Another common theme that's coming through is just related to, I suppose, how far does one go when trying to detail documentation? I think it's probably fair to say that both designers and building surveyors are potentially faced with this on a regular basis in terms of how far should the design documentation detail options for compliance, when how specific do they need to be? And for building surveyors, I suppose, you know, what's their the level of expectation there, and how far should they go in requiring documentation? The bushfire standard is obviously a good example of that in terms of itself offers a lot of different options for compliance depending on the you know, which BAL level a building is subject to. So I'm wondering if you can provide a bit of guidance or just sort of discuss you know, the practical solutions to that issue.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Amanda, and I guess, you know, there is information that you can't document on drawing, so you know, it's just not practical from a business perspective. So using specifications is a really good way to do that, and obviously it can still be site specific, but the specific requirements can be noted in a specification or similar. So you know, that's a lot of my experience with bushfire prone area buildings has been requiring a specification that indicates a lot of the compliance requirements. So that's a quite easy way. And I guess the key one is just to ensure that there's no conflicts between the architectural plans and the specifications or the supplementary information. That's something that the audits showed quite a lot of. So yeah, if you can't necessarily detail something, supplementing in the specifications is a great approach.
There's one question here about will there be an addendum to the actual NCC in regards to bushfire prone areas? Not 100% sure if this is what they're touching towards, but assuming this is reference to those kind of buildings listed in the the building regulations like the 9C and 9A being required to have those construction requirements. I believe that, Matt can correct me if I'm wrong, that the Tech and Reg department are looking at trying to get as many things out of the regulations that relate to construction and getting them into the National Construction Code as part of big variations or the like.
Yeah, and then nationally, they're also looking at incorporating building code provisions for kind of non-residential buildings as well. So yeah, that's definitely on the agenda from a national perspective.
A couple of other questions I'm seeing coming through related to extensions to existing dwellings. To what extent does the existing dwelling need to comply with current standards, and is there you know, some sort of threshold that that would require upgrade of the existing building?
Yeah, so it would be the partial compliance regulation. That might be something that's probably answered in writing, so we can refer to the specifics. But yeah, if the alterations, you know, are over that certain kind of volume amount or floor area, then it would trigger compliance.
Makes sense. Just a couple of clarifying questions on the audit methodology itself, just in terms of what the term bushfire prone area means in terms of the scope. I think we've answered this at least in one of those questions, but just for everyone's benefit, what was the scope of projects audited in terms of that bushfire prone area? Is it yeah, is it designated bushfire prone areas that we looked at?
Yes, yep. Yeah, we looked and we did try to get a selection from different kind of council areas as well, and we have got some additional permits to look at some other areas such as around Wyndham Vale and that, which are just kind of on the edge of the metropolitan area to look at in the future as well.
And that's probably a good thing to point out as well, that, you know, when we think about bushfire, it's not just a rural issue. There's also those kind of urban rural interface areas where they have, you know, they're in bushfire prone areas as well. So it isn't just a rural issue, it is also a kind of outer metro thing that needs to be considered as well.
Excellent. And perhaps just because we're right on time, one final question just related to practitioners who may have been subject to this audit. What's the approach in terms of communicating our findings directly to those people?
So with this, because it's still quite early in this program, most of this will be education based, and we'll be providing, so there won't be any disciplinary consequences, I suppose, for this. It'll be more about, I suppose, as most people may have seen at the conference, it was discussed about keeping people in the green channel, and that's the kind of the approach that we're taking with this. It's not like there's particular people that were doing the wrong thing or something. It was a fairly consistent information missing, so people just need to be alerted to that information. I think the on-site construction, we've seen kind of a fairly good result in most cases anyway. There are a number of things that were identified as non-compliant still, but there shouldn't hopefully be any on-site issues that are of safety concerns that need to be rectified immediately.
Great, thanks, Keesje. And I think with that, we'll wrap up the session. Thank you again to everybody for attending today. It was great to see such a big turnout. I hope you've taken away some valuable insights from the presentation today. Just a reminder that it will be available to all participants and to the general public after today's session. You'll receive a link to that within a few days of today's session, and also keep an eye out on the website and our YouTube channel for other relevant resources. We have a few more sessions coming up this year. We have another session on the conflict of interest in design, which will be very relevant for many practitioners coming up later this month. All the details on how you can register for those are on our website. So thank you again very much for your attendance today, and we wish you a lovely afternoon.